You ever had someone push you away, only to show up later, acting like nothing ever happened? Yeah, I'm talking about those avoidant types. The ones who ghost you, dodge emotional conversations, and seem allergic to vulnerability until suddenly they offer you friendship. Today, we're pulling back the curtain because this isn't just about relationships. It's about self-respect, boundaries, and understanding what's really going on when someone who avoids intimacy decides to reappear in your life. And let me tell you right now, it's not random. It's not harmless. And how you respond, that matters more than you think. Let's get real, let's get honest, and let's get you back in control. People with an avoidant attachment style are often misunderstood. On the surface, they can come off as independent, self-sufficient, maybe even cold or emotionally distant. But underneath that exterior is a complex pattern shaped by their early relationships, usually ones where emotional needs weren't consistently met. So they learned, often unconsciously, that relying on others is risky, that emotional closeness can lead to rejection, disappointment, or a loss of autonomy. So what do? They pull back, they create space, they keep their walls up, not because they don't care, but because that feels safer to them than getting too close and possibly getting hurt. This isn't about villainizing them. Avoidant behavior is a defense mechanism. It's rooted in emotional self-protection. You might notice that avoidant individuals tend to shut down during emotionally charged conversations, deflect vulnerability, or become uncomfortable when others express intense feelings. They may even disappear or ghost, not because they're cruel, but because they feel overwhelmed by intimacy or conflict. In their world, closeness can feel threatening, not comforting. Now, here's where it gets tricky. Because avoidants do have emotional needs, they do want connection, but they want it on their terms, at their pace, and with very clear boundaries, usually ones that keep people at arm's length. When they offer friendship, especially after distancing themselves, it can be confusing. It seems like a contradiction. Why would someone who avoided connection come back asking for it? The answer starts with understanding that avoidants aren't immune to loneliness. They just don't handle it the way others might. They might withdraw to self-soothe, but when the silence gets too loud, they'll resurface. Not necessarily because they've changed, but because they miss the emotional bond, just not the parts of it that felt too intense or demanding. Friendship, in this case, becomes the safe zone, a space where they can reconnect without feeling emotionally trapped, where the expectations are lower and the risks are more manageable. That's why understanding the avoidant attachment style matters so much. If you don't get what's driving their behavior, you'll take it personally. You'll think their distance means you're not enough. You'll think their offer of friendship is a sign of renewed closeness. But the truth is, it's rarely that simple. Avoidants don't usually offer friendship because they've suddenly become more emotionally available. They offer it because it gives them a way to maintain some connection without the vulnerability that deeper intimacy requires. And here's another layer. When avoidants offer friendship, it's often a form of control, not in a manipulative way, but in a survival-based way. They're trying to manage their emotional exposure. They want to feel close enough to someone without feeling too seen or too obligated. It's a protective strategy. Unless they've done serious self-work, that pattern will keep repeating. And so if you're dealing with someone who has an avoidant attachment style, you need to be brutally honest with yourself. Are you hoping they'll eventually open up more? Are you accepting crumbs, thinking it's a pathway back to the connection you once had? Because unless they've genuinely begun healing that avoidant pattern, offering friendship isn't necessarily a step forward, it's a step sideways, a way to keep you close, but not too close. That's why this isn't about changing them. It's about understanding you, understanding your own needs, understanding your boundaries. And most importantly, understanding that you deserve relationships where connection doesn't come with emotional confusion. Avoidants are not broken. They're just operating from an old emotional blueprint. And you can have compassion for that. But compassion doesn't mean self-abandonment. Once you understand the avoidant mindset, you can stop interpreting their behavior as a reflection of your worth and start seeing it as a reflection of their emotional framework. That clarity is powerful. It lets you decide what you're truly available for. Because love, real healthy love, requires safety, openness, and mutual emotional presence. And if someone isn't in a place to offer that, no matter how much they care, friendship may be all they can give. The question is that enough for you? When someone with an avoidant attachment style offers you friendship, especially after creating distance or cutting off emotional contact, it can feel like emotional whiplash. You might ask yourself, why now? What changed? Is this their way of coming back into my life for real? Or is it just another confusing move in a pattern that already hurt? The truth is, when avoidants offer friendship, it's rarely as straightforward as it seems. It's not always a clean gesture of reconnection. Instead, it's often a complex mix of emotional needs, fear of intimacy, guilt, and a desire for control over the dynamic. Avoidant individuals tend to retreat from relationships when they feel emotionally overwhelmed, exposed, or pressured. They need space to regulate themselves and protect their sense of independence. But space doesn't mean detachment. While they may seem emotionally disengaged, they still form bonds. They still miss people. They just don't express that in conventional ways. After pulling away, they might feel a lingering attachment or even guilt about how things ended. That's often when the offer of friendship appears. Not necessarily because they're ready for a deeper connection, but because they're looking for a version of connection that feels safer to them. To the avoidant, friendship is a low-pressure zone. It's a space where expectations are softer, emotional intensity is reduced, and the fear of being engulfed by someone else's needs is minimized. It allows them to reestablish contact without facing the vulnerabilities that pushed them away in the first place. In their mind, this is a safe compromise. They get to keep the emotional bond at arm's length. They might genuinely care about you and want you in their life, but only in a way that doesn't make them feel emotionally threatened. But this isn't always healthy for the other person. When someone has experienced emotional withdrawal or abandonment by an avoidant partner or friend, the sudden offer of friendship can feel like hope. It can stir up feelings of longing, confusion, and a desire to win them back. But if nothing about the avoidance behavior or emotional awareness has changed, then what's really being offered isn't growth, it's maintenance. They're not stepping forward. They're sidestepping the real emotional work that deeper relationships require. There's also an unconscious strategy at play. Avoidants don't usually plan this out deliberately, but offering friendship allows them to alleviate their guilt while maintaining control. They can feel like they've done the right thing by reaching out and offering something instead of nothing. But what they're really doing is creating a version of the relationship that they feel comfortable in, without fully considering how that version feels to you. And that dynamic can be deeply imbalanced, especially if you still have emotional investment in something deeper. It's important to understand that when avoidants offer friendship, they may believe they're being kind, even generous. In their view, this is vulnerability, this is effort. But to someone who desires emotional closeness, consistency, and transparency, this gesture can feel like a breadcrumb trail. It keeps you close enough to stay emotionally involved, but not close enough to feel truly secure or understood. That emotional limbo can be exhausting. Another reason avoidants may offer friendship is that they're testing the waters. They're not sure if they're ready for more, but they're curious if the connection still exists. They might want reassurance that you haven't shut the door entirely. But again, they're doing this without fully stepping into the discomfort of a real, honest conversation. They're using friendship as a soft entry point, one where they're not risking rejection in the same way they would if they openly said they wanted more. And while that might protect their emotional safety, it can put you in a situation where your emotional clarity becomes clouded. This is why it's so important to pay attention to patterns, not words. Is the person showing up differently? Are they demonstrating emotional availability, consistency, and accountability? Or is the offer of friendship just a recycled form of the same emotional distancing that hurt you before? Avoidants don't always realize how much confusion they create. Their version of closeness is shaped by what feels safe to them, not necessarily what feels fair or fulfilling to you. So when they offer friendship after pulling away, it's crucial to ask yourself, are they reaching out to meet you where you are, or are they inviting you to meet them where they're still stuck? Understanding the why behind their offer doesn't mean you have to accept it. It just means you can respond with clarity instead of confusion and choose what's truly right for you without holding on to a dynamic that only serves one side. The emotional safety loop is a powerful and often invisible cycle that drives the behavior of avoidant individuals in relationships. To understand why someone with an avoidant attachment style offers friendship instead of intimacy, you have to understand how they navigate safety, emotional safety, specifically. For avoidance, safety doesn't come from closeness. It comes from control, predictability, and distance. Intimacy, while desirable on some level, is also perceived as a threat because it often feels overwhelming, intrusive, or like a loss of independence. So they create a loop, a mental and emotional pattern that lets them experience connection without exposing themselves to the perceived dangers of being too close. Here's how it works. An avoidant person may initially engage in a relationship and even seem present, affectionate, and connected. But as the emotional stakes rise, whether through increasing vulnerability, demands for consistency, or expressions of deeper feelings, they start to feel unsafe. Not because the other person has done anything wrong, but because the emotional closeness itself triggers old fears. Fear of being engulfed, fear of losing their sense of self, fear of being depended on or needing someone too much. That's when they retreat. The shutdown begins. They may emotionally withdraw, create physical distance, or even end the relationship entirely. But that's not the end of the story. Over time, after the intensity fades and space is reestablished, the avoidant starts to feel safer again. Why? Because distance resets their nervous system. It gives them back a sense of control. No one's asking anything from them. No one's watching their emotional reactions or expecting deep sharing. The pressure is off. And once they feel safe again, they may start to miss the connection. Not the emotional demands of the relationship, but the companionship, the comfort, the bond. That's when the loop completes its first cycle. They reinitiate contact, often in the form of friendship. Friendship feels like a safe middle ground. It offers connection without commitment, affection without emotional intensity, and presence without pressure. It lets the avoidant feel close again without triggering the fear that caused them to retreat in the first place. But here's the issue. This loop can repeat endlessly if the avoidant person doesn't do the internal work to break it. It becomes a pattern of approach and retreat, of wanting connection but fleeing from vulnerability, of offering crumbs and calling it care. And if you're on the other end of that loop, it can be deeply destabilizing. The person on the receiving end often senses hope when contact is reestablished. They interpret the avoidance return as a sign of progress, as if emotional growth has taken place. But in most cases, the loop hasn't changed. Only the avoidant's sense of safety has. They're not offering friendship because they're ready to engage emotionally in a new way. They're offering it because the distance has reset the safety they need to feel comfortable again. And they assume you'll accept that as a substitute for the intimacy you likely want. This loop is self-protective for the avoidant, but it can be emotionally harmful for the other person. It places you in a reactive role where you're constantly adjusting to someone else's comfort zone, pulling back when they pull back, feeling relief when they return, only to go through the cycle again. You're essentially managing their emotional safety for them, often at the cost of your own needs. And over time, this can erode your self-worth, clarity, and sense of emotional stability. Understanding this loop is essential not just to protect yourself, but to make sense of the avoidance behavior. It's not random. It's not thoughtless. It's a deeply ingrained pattern built on the belief that true emotional closeness is unsafe. Unless that core belief changes through therapy, self-reflection, or significant life experiences, the loop doesn't go away. It just gets masked with friendlier language. So when someone avoids intimacy, then later reappears offering friendship, it's often their way of keeping the loop intact without facing the discomfort of growth. They want safety without sacrifice, presence without pressure. That's not always malicious, but it is self-serving. And if you don't recognize it, you can find yourself stuck in someone else's pattern, thinking it's progress when it's really repetition. Breaking the loop doesn't always mean cutting them off, but it does mean getting honest about what you want, what you need, and whether the relationship dynamic is truly mutual. Emotional safety should never be one-sided, because in a healthy relationship, both people feel safe, not just one. The power dynamic behind the phrase, just friends, from an avoidant person is often subtle, but it plays a huge role in shaping the emotional tone of the relationship. On the surface, it might seem like a simple gesture of goodwill, a way to stay connected to avoid tension or loss. But underneath, there's often an imbalance of emotional power that can leave the other person confused, disempowered, or even stuck in a loop of false hope. When an avoidant offers friendship, especially after retreating from closeness or emotional intimacy, they're not just redefining the relationship, they're often shifting the control back into their hands. Avoidant individuals typically struggle with emotional vulnerability and closeness. These things can make them feel exposed or trapped. So when things get too emotionally intense, they tend to withdraw. But once they've created space and feel emotionally regulated again, they may return and offer something they feel comfortable with, friendship. What's crucial to understand is that this friendship isn't always a mutual emotional arrangement. It can often be a controlled environment where the avoidant gets to feel close, but only on their terms. This is where the power dynamic comes in. By offering friendship instead of real relational repair or emotional accountability, the avoidant person maintains emotional control. They're saying, consciously or not, I'm willing to have you in my life, but only at a level that doesn't challenge my comfort zone. And because the person on the receiving end often still cares deeply or hopes for more, they might agree to this friendship even if it doesn't actually meet their emotional needs. That's a major imbalance because one person is regulating the terms of the connection while the other is adjusting, compromising, or suppressing their own feelings just to stay close. In this way, the offer of friendship can function as a form of emotional leverage. The avoidant gets to avoid confrontation, vulnerability, or emotional growth while still benefiting from your presence, loyalty, and attention. They may not mean to be manipulative, but the result can feel manipulative nonetheless because the relationship is no longer a shared experience. It's one person dictating the structure and the other trying to adapt to it. This kind of imbalance often leads to a quiet form of emotional depletion. Another layer to this dynamic is that the avoidant often feels reassured by your willingness to accept their terms. It confirms in a subtle way that they can maintain emotional connection without doing the hard work of building intimacy. They don't have to risk discomfort, emotional conflict, or deeper accountability. They can simply redefine the relationship to suit their needs, and because you care, you might accept it even if it hurts. This reinforces their avoidant pattern and keeps you emotionally tethered to a version of the relationship that might no longer serve you. Over time, this dynamic can become exhausting. You may begin to question yourself. Am I asking for too much? Was I too intense? Should I just accept what they're willing to give? These questions come from a place of emotional imbalance, where you've begun to internalize the avoidant person's boundaries as limitations on your own needs. That's the quiet damage this power dynamic creates. It shifts the focus from mutual connection to emotional survival. You're no longer expressing your feelings freely. You're managing the relationship in a way that won't scare them off. There's also often a hidden benefit for the avoidant. They get the emotional support, the companionship, sometimes even the closeness of a relationship without having to commit or show up consistently. They maintain emotional autonomy while benefiting from emotional connection. Meanwhile, you may find yourself stuck in an emotional gray zone, not quite in, not quite out, always hoping for something more. This can be incredibly draining, especially if you're someone who values emotional honesty and depth. Recognizing this power dynamic doesn't mean blaming the avoidant person. Many aren't consciously trying to manipulate or control. They're simply protecting themselves the only way they know how. But awareness is key. If you don't see the imbalance, you can find yourself giving far more than you're receiving and mistaking proximity for partnership. Friendship should never be a consolation prize or a way to avoid emotional responsibility. It should be mutual, respectful, and grounded in honesty. The moment you recognize that the offer of friendship isn't meeting your emotional needs, you gain your power back. You stop waiting for someone to change and start asking yourself what you truly need and whether this dynamic honors that. Because no matter how much history, chemistry, or potential exists, a relationship that only works for one person isn't real connection. It's a performance, and you deserve more than that. One of the most confusing parts of interacting with someone who has an avoidant attachment style is trying to figure out whether their actions reflect genuine emotional intent or just mixed signals rooted in fear. When they offer friendship, reach out unexpectedly, or express care in subtle, inconsistent ways, it can be deeply disorienting because their behavior often contradicts their words. They might say they're not ready for intimacy, but then act jealous. They might distance themselves, only to check in weeks later, as if nothing happened. These patterns can make it incredibly hard to know whether they truly want connection or are simply stuck in an emotional tug-of-war within themselves. Mixed signals from an avoidant person are not usually intended to be manipulative. Instead, they reflect a deep internal conflict between the desire for closeness and the fear of vulnerability. On one hand, they miss the connection, the comfort, and the emotional bond. On the other hand, getting too close threatens their sense of autonomy or triggers unresolved emotional wounds. So they do something many people in their position do. They show up in small, confusing ways. They test the waters. They give just enough to keep the bond alive, but not enough to actually deepen the connection. That's where the emotional fog sets in. From your side, this often leads to constant second guessing. You start analyzing everything they say and do. You wonder, if they didn't care, why would they reach out? Why would they offer friendship at all? Maybe this is just how they show love. And that's where it becomes dangerous, because emotional inconsistency can easily be mistaken for emotional depth. When someone gives you crumbs of attention or vulnerability, it can feel powerful if you're starved for clarity. But that doesn't make it healthy or real. It just makes it familiar, especially if you're someone who tends to be more anxious or deeply attuned to the emotions of others. This pattern can hook you in. You start trying to decode their behavior instead of asking yourself the more important question, is this actually meeting my needs? Recognizing mixed signals for what they are requires emotional clarity and a willingness to step back from your own hope. It means separating their behavior from your desire for connection. If someone says they care but consistently avoids closeness, minimizes your feelings, or disappears when things get real, that's not emotional maturity, that's avoidance. And if they come back later offering friendship or half-hearted gestures of reconnection without taking accountability or making actual changes, that's not growth, it's repetition. But genuine intent looks different. A person who truly wants connection, even if they struggle with avoidance, will begin to show signs of awareness. They'll acknowledge their distance. They'll make consistent efforts to communicate. They'll respect your boundaries, not just ask you to adapt to theirs. Most importantly, they'll take responsibility for their own patterns instead of expecting you to manage the emotional load. That's the difference between mixed signals and genuine progress. One keeps you in emotional limbo. The other creates clarity, even if it's slow. The tricky part is that many avoidants aren't fully aware of the impact of their behavior. They may genuinely believe they're doing the best they can. They may not realize how confusing their mixed signals are. So when they offer friendship, it might feel to them like a generous or vulnerable act. They might think, this is what I'm capable of right now, and assume that should be enough. But your responsibility is not to adjust your emotional needs downward to match what someone else is comfortable giving. Your responsibility is to know yourself well enough to say, this isn't enough for me, if that's the truth. Waiting around to see if mixed signals turn into something more is a painful way to live. It drains your energy and puts your emotional well-being in the hands of someone who isn't sure how to hold it. You deserve consistency, not confusion. You deserve presence, not potential. And most importantly, you deserve to be in relationships where you don't have to guess what someone feels because they show it clearly and consistently. So when faced with an avoidant person offering friendship or showing signs of interest after pulling away, look past the surface. Ask yourself, are they showing up differently? Are they being honest and direct? Or are they still operating from a place of fear, leaving you to interpret the gaps? Trust behavior over hope. Trust patterns over promises. And above all, trust yourself to walk away from emotional ambiguity, even when it's wrapped in the comfort of familiarity. So here's the truth. When an avoidant person offers you friendship, especially after emotional withdrawal or disconnection, it's not always the clean gesture it appears to be. It can be a way to keep connection without committing, to soothe guilt without real accountability, or to feel safe without truly being vulnerable. That doesn't make them a villain, but it does mean you have to stop writing their story in your head and start reading their behavior in front of you. You're not here to wait in emotional limbo. You're not here to accept crumbs and call it love. You're here to be met fully, clearly, consistently. Friendship should never be a halfway house for feelings someone's too afraid to own. And if it is, you have every right to step out of that dynamic, not out of bitterness, but out of self-respect. Because the moment you stop accepting confusion as connection, you reclaim your power. You stop trying to decode someone else's fear and start honoring your own truth. And that's where real clarity begins, not in the offer they make, but in the boundary you hold.